time, it is my privilege and honor to introduce our guest speaker. I'm going to read a little bit about her so you'll know. Juliet Simone, she's the program director of the Health Program Director for the Oasis Institute. And it says she oversees 9 centers around the country. She's a master trainer for self-management resource centers, diabetes and chronic disease, self-management programs, and a matter of value. She obtained her Master's of Public Health from the University of Minnesota and her Master of Business Administration from Webster University. And I was told she got up really early this morning to be with her. So we are very fortunate to have her. Let's give her a round of applause.
All right, good morning, everybody. Place for my coffee. All right, don't even forget it there, it'll get all cold. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here and also for being here. I know the third day of the conference, you can usually feel a little bit like mashed potatoes, so thank you for your attention. And how has the conference been so far? Sounds like pretty good? That's the kind of energy you don't have to say, how was the conference? You know, make people do it a second time. I think that's redundant. So, the title of my presentation this morning is Missouri's Hill to Climb. And I was asked to talk a little bit about chronic conditions and also the role of lay leaders. And those are 2 topics that are near and dear to my heart. So it's with my pleasure that I am here to do that. And thank you for the introduction. So I work out of St. Louis and am the National Health and Program Director for the Oasis Institute. And we're a nonprofit that does 3 lines of business for older adults. And that's through community engagement, lifelong learning, and active lifestyles. So most people go into healthcare because they want to help others, right? Most want to make a difference in their community, and many wish to care for the most vulnerable of populations. So who are vulnerable populations? Sure, there are groups of people who may not have a voice, or may not have a voice just yet, such as children, people with mental disabilities, sometimes people with physical disabilities, older people potentially with limited mobility. These populations are vulnerable, yes, and greatly benefit from advocates fighting for their rights, for justice, and for health. There are other voices that are marginalized. Women, people of color, often immigrants. And then there are other kinds of vulnerable populations as well. And there are groups of people who are sometimes hard to reach. Some of those hard to reach groups include undocumented immigrants, people without health insurance, people whose first language maybe isn't English, people in prison, people who inject drugs, for instance. But what do all those hard to reach and vulnerable groups of people have in common? Lay leaders reach them better. So my first exposure to the power of lay leaders was when I was getting my master's in public health in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I was working with a group called the Minnesota AIDS Project. And they had a project that they were looking into about how to reach groups of people who inject drugs with a public health message. And that sounded to me like a really interesting challenge to take on. And I certainly didn't do it alone. But we figured out that the best way to reach people who inject drugs was through others in the community who inject drugs, who are leaders in that community. And that may be a surprise to some people to think about. It certainly was to me, that there may be leaders in a community like that, but there are leaders in every community. And those were the right people to reach to try to share health information about safer practices and how to reduce the transmission of things like hepatitis C and HIV. And a lot of times people are hard to reach for a variety of reasons. This particular group was hard to reach because they were generally doing something illegal and they wanted to remain in the shadows of people in the hospital system and of course law enforcement. So finding those people was a challenge, but once we found a few people that were influential in that community, we were able to get a positive health message out to others and hopefully save some lives, at least certainly reduce transmission of some of those diseases, as I mentioned. So that being said, outsiders can have a hard, if not impossible time reaching certain kinds of groups. And building trust to reach people in those communities takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, doesn't it, to get to build those relationships. And we all know that mostly our lives are built around relationships, whether it's with a health message or other kinds of trust or faith. It's all about relationships. And what was interesting and powerful about that experience too is that I was there to volunteer also to give people clean injection needles so that they could have a reduced risk of transmitting hepatitis C. And we weren't there to share with people information about how to quit. We weren't there to shame people's behaviors. We were there to meet them where they were at on that particular day and help them be healthier that day. If they had questions about how to get help or how to quit drugs or any questions about rehab, we also had that information. But we were there just to help them where they were at that day. And I did see in my year that I spent working with that community, some people come by and say, well, kind of just with their head hung low and in a bunch of shame, well, you're just going to tell me to just stop, aren't you? I said, no, that's not my job today. I'm just here to make sure that you get what you need to be healthier. And comments like that really helped build the trust of the community. And then that same person several months later came by and said, I think I'm ready now. I'm ready for some information about how to quit. And so I was so elated to hear that, of course. And some people weren't there yet, but he was. And that was my first experience really showing the power of what lay leaders could do in the community, and then also delivering health messages in a non-judgmental way. And so that's one way to get the job done. And you all know that. This is what you do. You know that the power you have to reach people starts with trust. And chronic conditions and information about prevention and management can go in the same way that the message for reducing transmission of hepatitis C and HIV went for me in Minneapolis. And you all know that sharing information about management of chronic conditions can help your colleagues, your neighbors, your community members live longer, healthier lives with fewer complications. So we're going to talk a little bit then about how Missouri is faring as far as chronic conditions go. You've probably heard over the last couple days, for the last couple years, maybe the last several decades, and it's still unfortunately true that Missouri has a higher burden of almost all chronic conditions compared to the rest of the country. We have a higher prevalence of smoking, of physical activity, of not enough fruit and vegetable consumption, of obesity, of hypertension, of high cholesterol, and diabetes. But this doesn't depress me. This gives me an opportunity to work with all of you and others across the state, because we have a little bit of a hill to climb here. And we're on the right path, and continuing to work together, we can see differences in this. So what has led to this higher prevalence conditions in general. And is there anything special about Missouri? Well, of course there's things special about Missouri. We're all here in it. But some of those unhealthy behaviors certainly have something to do with the increased prevalence of those chronic conditions. And we're stubborn, right? That's where our motto comes from, the show me state. We're a stubborn state. There are also, though, some demographic shifts that have contributed to this over the past, 100 or so years. So people are living longer in general. And I have just a few slides to share with you with some visuals. Oh, this just shows the percentage of older adults in Missouri that have 2 or more chronic conditions. And you can see there that it's not incredibly higher than the national average, but when you talk about that, the amount of people in the U.S. and Missouri, it does kind of add up those 0.2%. You can see here that this is the life expectancy in the U.S. Since 1900. And that's the graph that starts on the left there. And you can see that the life expectancy in 1900 was between 45 and 50 years old. And this graph ends in 2008. Obviously it's 10 years ago, but it's been just a steady incline since then. So we are all living longer. There are differences between men and women. There are differences between white folks and African Americans in the US, most certainly. But every group has been on the rise. Just for fun, does anybody have any idea what that major dip is? Aw, you're cheating. You work for the health department, Mike. But yes, that was the Spanish flu. And it's an interesting public health history lesson, and I can sort of geek out on that for a really long time, and I won't torture you all with that. However, it's interesting because unlike most flus, this particular flu had a higher mortality rate for younger people, and most flus have a higher mortality for younger people and older people. And so this one was very, very different in that way. So one of the important factors of why chronic conditions have increased over time is because because we have the luxury of getting old enough to get chronic conditions. I know that might sound kind of like a strange way to think about it, that we have the pleasure to live with diabetes, and we have the opportunity to live with arthritis. But many of our ancestors did not live long enough to have those opportunities. Isn't that a positive spin on chronic conditions here? And then another element that's really fascinating to look at the demographic and population shifts over time is the baby boomer generation. So this graph shows on one side of it, to the left is women, on the right side is men on each of these 3 different charts. And the first one is from 1971, when most baby boomers were either teenagers or in their young early 20s. The middle chart shows in 2011, which is kind of that magic time where the oldest of the baby boomers was starting to turn 65 years old. And then the chart on the right shows the predictions for 2030, which is, we often use that time to talk about aging in America, because that's the year when the youngest baby boomer will turn 65. And so at the bottom of the chart, it's age 0, and at the very top of the chart, it's about 90 plus years old. And so it shows you sort of the bulk of the population in the US and how old they are at those different year increments. And so in 1971, you can see there dramatically that those blue graphs are where the baby boomers were young, and they make up the most significant proportion of the population. And if you look up to the very top of that graph, there are not all that many older adults in the population, are there? And think about all those people working and paying into Medicare and Social Security that are on the bottom part of that chart. And then at the top of the chart, there aren't as many recipients. The middle chart there shows again the bulge of the baby boomer generation as they are working adults and getting near to the retirement age. Most baby boomers were at the peak of their career during these years, and in the 90s and even the 80s for sure. But you can still see in 2011, the baby boomers is proportionately the biggest part of the population of the US. And with all of those booms, our culture has been changed. So you think about what the baby boomers have done as a generation. When the baby boomers, and many of you in this room I'm sure are of that generation, there were so many new kids in the US that's when we had to build out so many more elementary schools. That's when the suburbs became a thing, because people wanted to have some space to stretch out and grow their families. That's when a lot of our libraries were built too. And our economy boomed when the baby boomers were in their peak working years. And so then you can see there in 2030, which is now only strangely 12 years away, right? Look at the proportion of baby boomers that'll be over 65. They only really second the bulge in the middle, which isn't really a bulge anymore, but that's millennials, and those are the baby boomers' children. But look at the proportion there. We have to figure out as a society how to help and manage that many older adults in our society. This is a brand new thing for us in the US and around the world. Because if you look at 1971 and look how many folks were over 65, there weren't that many. And so managing chronic conditions and expanding the roles and opportunities for lay leaders to deliver these health messages in our communities is going to be absolutely crucial to make sure that this important generation of ours in the US has a chance to live well with as few complications as possible and to have as many years to do everything that they want and need to do that they can. So the 20th century did both of these things. It increased our life expectancy, and then in the US we saw the generation of the baby boomers really increase the proportion. So not just the raw number, but the proportion of older adults in the population. And so longer lives is one major factor for why we have more chronic conditions than ever. Additionally, in Missouri, we're going to be having a higher percentage of older adults over the next several years than the general US too. So in 2010, there were 14% of Missourians that were over 65, and by 2030, there will be 21% over 65. So think of that, that's 1 in 5 Missourians will be over 65, and again, just a short 12 years from now. So this is okay, I'm gonna do a short quiz before I go to that, because again, public health dork, I think it's interesting. So going back to the sort of the life expectancy, because it is so relevant to chronic conditions. Can anybody take a guess at what some of the top 3 or 5 causes of death were back in 1900? Just yell them out. Tuberculosis, that is one of them, yes. Malaria, not so much in the US, but definitely. Infectious diseases, yeah. Polio I don't think it was a top 3, but it was probably up there, but it certainly caused a lot of disability, for sure. Absolutely. So it's flu and pneumonia, which we take for granted a little bit, don't we? I think we do, and I hope you all get your flu shot. This is a giant soapbox, but it's a soapbox nonetheless. We died of flu and pneumonia, our ancestors did. Our great-grandmothers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers died of flu and pneumonia, of tuberculosis, and of gastrointestinal infections. And so what do all those things have in common? They're infectious. And they spread, right? And they spread for a lot of reasons. They spread from people living in close quarters. You know, if you can ever picture those old, you know, like Lower East Side Manhattan, you know, like immigrant communities where there were, you know, folks coming over the ocean and, you know, 30 folks living in a 2-bedroom apartment, you know, then you can imagine if one of them gets the flu, you know, the other 29 folks who live in that apartment are going to get the flu too. And so over the 20th century, we saw the most significant strides really in public health that any other era has seen, and that we may ever see again because there was so much to be done during that time. And we die of different things now because we have better, guess what, sanitation. We have, you know, sewer systems that clean our water and, you know, toilets that flush and electricity to keep things running and to keep things clean. We have food safety. That's an enormous reason why we don't die of things like gastrointestinal diseases so much anymore. And also, of course, someone mentioned polio. We have vaccines. So think about the reduction in deaths due to like flu and pneumonia. A lot of that is because we have vaccines too. And polio, our ancestors, and some of you in this room may remember it as a kid. It was scary. It was a terrifying thing for parents to think of their kids getting polio. We don't have that fear anymore. And that's thanks to public health measures. And then of course the medical community, I have to give a nod to, you know, surgery and medicine and antibiotics and all those things, but by and large, public health efforts save a bulk of lives. So what do we die from today? So about 120 years after 1900, what are the things that we die of? Yeah, you got it. Heart disease, cancer, stroke, and COPD. It's called chronic lower respiratory. It's not COPD anymore, but that's how it's been better branded, right? Absolutely. And what do those things have in common? They're chronic, yeah, and some of it has to do with lifestyle. Smoking is certainly a risk factor for many of those. So that's an enormous dramatic shift in the US and also many countries around the world, is that we, again, sort of have the opportunity to get old enough to die from chronic conditions today than our ancestors did. So in some ways, it's a real privilege. Here are the leading causes of death. That was meant to be a little joke, a little lighthearted. But so here are the leading causes of death in Missouri, and you can see there from 2010 that heart disease, cancer, and then chronic lower respiratory diseases were the top 3. But you can see there that heart disease and cancer, definitely higher proportions than everything below it. And these aren't just for folks over 65. This is for all people. And I know these are really small words, but this is the mortality from infectious disease, 1900 versus 2010. And the most important thing about this is just to show the dramatic downswing in those deaths. And then in opposite fashion, the mortality from heart disease and cancer goes in the opposite direction. So they really flip-flopped over time. And so this is a shift that we have seen in certainly, the United States, obviously, and then also other wealthier countries that have the infrastructure for things like good sanitation and food safety practices, and an FDA to help regulate things like that. So I want to share another story, partially because it's fun, but also relevant to this conversation, about my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer working in the mountains of Peru. And like I worked in Minneapolis with injection drug users, I worked with mothers with young children as lay leaders to deliver public health messages in the mountains of Peru. And here's the most precious picture. This is me and my little host sister. Her name is Sarita, and we were walking home from school back to the house there that we lived in the background there. So it was a magical place, and And well, I had an incredible experience. Not always positive, but it was incredible. But this was a very isolated, rural mountain village. And Peru, like many countries around the world, is in a huge time of growth and development. And where capital cities like Lima has a lot of really wealthy people, a lot of commerce, a lot of free, market, a lot of business. Also has a lot of slums and a lot of areas of very, very low income with less infrastructure like we have here with, plumbing and access to, packaged foods and things like that. But where I lived in the mountains, it was probably how most of us and our ancestors lived several hundred years ago, by and large. We had electricity that went off on and off over time. We had faucets that, where water came out of it most of the time, but it wasn't clean. We had to boil the water. Like what happens with a lot of areas, is that there was a creek down in the mountain valley, but sometimes a cow or a donkey would die upstream, and then there would be, kind of the carcass would contaminate the water. And then there was giardia and all kinds of other nasty bugs that we had to clean with the water. So the kids in this town were really sick a lot. There was also some pretty rampant malnutrition. The Peruvians' favorite foods in these areas were rice and potatoes. And then I called it the trifecta of carbohydrates because sometimes we had rice, potatoes, and spaghetti noodles. That was the best meal. So had all the carbs together. And so many of the children had problems from drinking unclean water and from malnutrition. And then something else that was really interesting is they were also understimulated. So they had sort of some developmental delays in their language and sort of just their general affect. And I didn't realize that was something cultural. That we in the United States, when we see a baby at the grocery store in line, we're like, oh, hi, who's the handsome little guy? Or like, look at your cute little shoes. We talk to babies in general, and that's cultural. I thought that was just something that humans sort of did, but that wasn't really part of the culture in the Andes where I lived. And so when babies aren't talked to and laughed with and just sort of pointed out things in the world, their minds didn't grow quite as fast and develop. So those were some of the issues that I was working on with mothers with young children. And then another thing that, again, most of our ancestors also did was cook over an open fire. And so they had traditional gender roles, and so women were disproportionately affected by eye infections and upper respiratory infections from cooking over an open stove, 3 meals a day. And then guess who else had those issues too? Were the tiny babies that they were, often carrying on their backs or holding while they were doing that. And so those were the populations that I worked with in Peru. But I spoke pretty terrible Spanish, but it didn't really matter because the native language in the mountains where I lived was Quechua. So the family that I lived with, I had a revolutionary host mom. She was about 4 foot and some change, but man, was she fierce. And she had no formal education. Not many people did in the mountains here. But she had taken workshops and every opportunity that she could to learn about things like nutrition and early childhood stimulation so that the next generation of kids in her village had a better chance. And she took me in, and I lived with them for 2 years. And I wore their clothes best I could. I was kind of the tallest peak in the village, but sweaters on me were like 3/4 length, but it worked out okay. They thought it was cute. And I ate their food, and I marched in their parades, and I did all that stuff. And so being really integrated in that community helped build that trust that I was talking about earlier. That's so important to get those health messages across. But the other most important thing that I did there was to work with my host mother. And that 4 foot and some change, revolutionary Peruvian woman spoke both Spanish and Quechua, so she served as a translator to some of the other mothers that spoke no Spanish. And she knew the culture, she knew the people. So she helped me deliver those messages and to other lay leaders to get those so important health messages of nutrition and hygiene and stimulation to their kids. And I do remember one funny story where I was talking about the stimulation, and I said, you don't have to know any songs, you can just make something up. And so I just asked if I could borrow a little kid. I borrowed a little kid and I just held it up, and I was trying to sing, I did sing in my worst Spanish and my about 3 Quechua words that I know. And I was just pointing like, there is the tree, and there is a creek, and there is and they all just thought it was the funniest thing they had ever seen, and it probably was. So I left, sort of happily embarrassed. It was okay. So, I'm not sure what kind of difference, I made at the end of it, and how I certainly know that, I made a deep impact on my Peruvian family that I lived with, at least, as they have made a deep impact on me. But I do hope that Rita was able to continue that health message long after I left, and with the other women in the community. And hopefully there's a generation of kids that are just, again, a little bit healthier, a little bit more stimulated to go on. But again, the word in I don't know if there's any Spanish speakers in here, but confianza was yes. Hello, my Spanish speakers. I was really bad, again, it was really bad. But the confianza, is that the right way? That's the trust, right? There's not a true, direct English translation, but it was something even deeper than trust, right? And it was an understanding and a compassion in there. But you had to develop that with the folks that you worked with. So when I moved back to the US, I really, really, really wanted to figure out how to continue the power of the lay leader. And I didn't know where I was going to work. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where in the US I was going to live. But I came back home to St. Louis, and I've been here ever since. You know that boomerang effect with your hometown, right? You can leave, but you always come back. I'm so happy to have been here now since I came back from Peru, which has been about 6.5 years. And I found, honestly, my dream job with Oasis in St. Louis. And it was continuing the work of lay leaders. This time it was working with older adults. And this time it was working on chronic condition management and falls prevention, my other favorite public health topic. And exercise and healthy lifestyle behaviors. And I didn't really know anything about working with the older adult population specifically, but I knew that it wasn't going to matter because the power of the lay leader was going to carry the knowledge that I had to learn, or the knowledge gap that I had, and that I could learn that. So, some of the work that we have left to do in Missouri is certainly making sure that those older adults have the resources necessary, as we looked at, again, because we're going to have more older adults to help make sure that have a better life. And also we have to work on disparities between white folks and African Americans and our Latino brothers and sisters. And in certain cases, the disparities in these chronic diseases in Missouri are actually increasing. And at least I think that we know now that there's a movement, and people are talking about it, that it is so much more than just access to healthcare and the genes that you were born with, right? We've been talking more and more, and it's more public about these socioeconomic factors and about the environment around us and how those affect our health. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that too. Oh, right, I had a couple other pictures from Peru here. I forgot about. Sorry, let me go back and just close that loop. So there's Peru. Peru's a big place. It's about the size, square footage, or square mileage of California. And chronic lower respiratory disease, heart disease, and Alzheimer's were their top 3 causes of death. But traffic accidents were actually, again, about the top 10 still. And that's the road that I traveled up the mountain, so yeah, not surprised. It was terrifying. One time I actually met the film crew from Ice Road Truckers at like the bar. Because, you saw other gringos there and you're like, hey, what are you guys doing here? Like, we're deep in the mountains. They're like, oh, we're the film crew for Ice Road Truckers. And I'm like, oh God, I can't tell my parents until I come home safely. But you can see that the top 6 health risks in Peru were malnutrition, as I mentioned. And then also, the top 6, air pollution was up there too. So those are things that, again, it's not a problem in the US, but it's not our top 6 health risks. Oh, that road. I can't look at it anymore. So here are some of those social determinants of health, though, that have an influence, and a big influence on our health. And again, I look at this as more of a positive message than a depressing message. And I will help us all get there to that positive aspect of this. But if this entire pie makes up our health and the things that affect our health, only 10% of it has to do with our access to health care. And that's important, don't get me wrong. When I get sick, I want to know that I can go to a doctor, that I can afford it. So that is something that we all still have to fight for, especially here in Missouri. Our physical environment has a lot to do with our health. Has anyone, especially those from St. Louis, have heard about the landfill in Bridgeton, right? With the nuclear waste under it, there's a cancer cluster. We couldn't help if we were born in that community. And a lot of times, people have a hard time understanding, well, why don't you just move? Well, when you really sit down and look at the economics of that, it's not as easy as it sounds for most people, is it? The same with people who live in floodplains and, and in places like New Orleans or Houston or Miami. Like, just move, why don't you just move? Well, again, when we really get down to it, those things aren't as easy as they sound. 10% of our overall health has to do with our parents. I know we wish we could blame so much more on them, but we can only blame about 10% of our physical health. We can blame other things of our mental health, right? But our physical health doesn't have all that much to do with our family history. But 30% of our overall health has to do with the little things that we do every day. How we eat, if we choose to smoke or not, if we get adequate rest, if we get some physical activity, if we socialize. That is so important, and we're learning more and more about that, and the importance of remaining engaged in any way. And all of you that are here already know that, but we all know probably 4 people in our lives that don't get out enough, and that are getting isolated and more depressed. And that's concerning for our overall health. And then 40% of our overall health has to do with our social and economic factors. And those are not easy problems to solve. But that doesn't mean that we have to stop trying or that we should. We absolutely have to try. We have to fix these things. We have to close the gap in disparities between all groups of people, but especially between racial and ethnic differences, because you can see there that we cannot blame differences in genetics and ancestry on our overall health. So that means, thank you. So that means that 70% of our health are things that we've created. We've set up infrastructure to keep people from having the same sort of equity and access, the same kind of high quality communities, the same access to fruit and vegetables, to jobs, to transportation. So if we made all that, that means we can tear it all down and start again. And that we can make a better community through those social and economic factors. And with that, we can all have better health. We can close that disparity. We have to. We have to do it. This is unacceptable. And if we all continue to work together, we can totally do it. And but we need a lot of people at the table, right? Community health workers and lay leaders are an enormous component of helping close this gap and making our state better, the health of our people in our state better. But we need lots of people from other sectors to help with that too. We need politicians, we need economic development, and we need help from every element to create a more equitable society. So, some of these things are a little bit out of the control of health professionals, but we all are citizens and can talk to people that we know who are in charge. We can talk to our representatives. We can talk to other leaders in the community, to leaders of faith who have influence. Doing that in St. Louis, we're opening a new Oasis Center at New Northside in the North City area. So for any of you who are from the St. Louis area and you know about that, about the New Northside and Pastor Burton, come talk to me about that because I'm so excited to be doing that. So this also shows the ecological arrangement of our culture, and this doesn't just affect health, but it certainly affects health. And you can see there that individuals and all of our tiny differences are really embedded within a bigger system, right? We're embedded in our friends and our families and our groups that we hang out with and that we go to church with and that we work with, and all of you in this room are in that group together. The third biggest one is organizations and our communities and our culture, American culture, Missouri culture. What is that? It could mean a lot of different things, but we certainly have a culture. It's different than Oregon and it's different than Florida, right? And then even bigger, our governments and our policies and our infrastructure and our systems. And so none of these things, as you can see, are live outside of those bigger circles. We are all intertwined and we are all embedded in this. So we have to affect all of these levels to affect one of them. So I also have 4 tricks to a healthy life, just 4 tricks. It's really easy in theory, of course. So the good thing about the 4 tricks to a healthy life, to affect those health behaviors, again, that make up 30% of our overall health, are, guess what? Anybody have any ideas? Exercise, eat well, don't smoke, and what's the other one that we often forget about? Get good sleep. I'm sorry these aren't like more interesting tricks, right? We all know about these. They're not always easy. They're not always easy. But I put the graphic of the double arrow there to just also highlight that this is a continuum. And you don't have to do all of those things at once, and you don't have to be absolutely perfect at all of those things all at the same time to make better, to have improvements in your health. You can just do a little bit better in all of those, and you can get further down the continuum and be a little bit healthier. And that's the message that we all try to give to other people too, right? And just like working with the clean needles and the needle exchange in Minneapolis, you have to meet people where they're at to build the trust. And all of you know how important it is to listen to the people you're serving and to the people you're working with, and try to work with barriers that they have to be down this health continuum, and to try to make little strides. And we may not be able to overcome every single barrier, certainly not all at once, right? But if we can make little strides and build that trust and get just a little further down that path, we will lift Missouri. We will all be better off. We will close that gap in disparities, and we will all live longer and healthier lives. So going back to the beginning about the hill that we have to climb here, this is my little joke about Missouri. So this is the bell curve, right? And I really, really just want Missouri to be average. I want to be in the middle of the bell curve and not on the lower half, right? So that's the hill to climb, and that's the rally cry. Let's just be average for the nation, guys. We don't have to be over there and be the healthiest state to make improvements right now. We have a lot of improvement to make, and man, that would be amazing one day if we could be the #1 healthiest state in the country, right? But until that day, let's just get to the top of the hill. Thank you.
A small token, show you our appreciation. And I'm sure she has inspired many of you to want to go out and be lay leaders in your community. And that's our challenge today. Tell 10 people what you learned today. We've learned a lot about having a growth mindset. And you can go out and share so that we can have a high quality of life. If I didn't get anything from MIMA, I got that. That I want to be the best me I can be, and I can be the best me I can be by having a growth mindset and sharing with others. Thank you.